Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nancy Woodrogel with the University of Illinois Extension Community and Economic Development Program. We're happy to host another BEAD deep dive with the Illinois Office of Broadband in the Illinois Broadband Lab. We are happy to welcome back Devin Bronstein, who will kick off today's session as well and introduce the program and our additional guest speaker. Welcome, Devin. Welcome, our panelists. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time. You can take it from here.
Great. Thanks so much, Nancy. Hi, everyone. Devin Bronstein here from the Illinois Office of Broadband. Apologies, I am in transit today, so hopefully I don't cut out, but we'll be passing it off to our main speaker shortly. This is our weekly webinar series that dives into different topics related to the BEAD program, Connect Illinois Round 4, specifically going into things that might be different from previous Connect Illinois rounds to help get folks familiar ahead of our sub-grantee selection process this fall. So today's session will focus on NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and we'll be hearing from our guest speaker, Jill from NTIA. So you can go to the next slide. I shared a little context already, but essentially the goal is to break down different topics of the BEAD program so folks are familiar ahead of that formal application process. Next slide. I'll give a very, very short recap of BEAD and where we are to date, and then we'll hand it over to Jill to walk us through NEPA and permitting requirements. All right. So to recap, BEAD, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, is a federal grant program that aims to get all American households and businesses connected to high-speed, affordable internet. It is a $42 billion federal grant program with funds going towards any costs associated with deploying service to all eligible households. And on our next slide, this is a dive into the Illinois specific goals of BEAD. So Illinois was allocated $1.04 billion to connect all unserved and underserved locations to broadband over the next 5 years. Our goal is to ensure universal coverage. We'll prioritize projects based on the speeds available. We'll have a broadband affordability focus. And this is a 5-year program with a 1-year sub-grantee selection process and 4-year implementation phase. We are rolling right along on our process. Folks who have participated in pre-qualifications should have received a second round of feedback. Anyone who has not received that second round of feedback should expect that in the next week. And based on some feedback that I've gotten over the past few weeks, we do now have all pre-qualification participants posted on our website. So this is anyone who participated in pre-qual, doesn't go into the specific outcomes since we're still rolling through that process. But if you're looking to understand what internet service providers are interested in BEAD, who might be interested in connecting your community, that is a great place to go. So I will be sure to link to that website in our recap email. Another exciting milestone is that last week, we presented the sort of concept of the BEAD NOFO Connect Illinois Round 4 to DCEO leadership. That's the agency where the Illinois Office of Broadband sits, and we did get their green light. So our final step is finishing up our challenge process curing with NTIA, and once we get that green light, we'll incorporate that final eligibility data into a map that you will actually see a preview of in next week's webinar. So stay tuned for more specific dates once we have more clarity into the timing there. And with that, I will just go ahead and hand it over to Jill to introduce herself and kick off our main programming for today. And Jill, if you want to share your screen so you can control the slides, feel free to take screen share.
Great, thank you. Are we good?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Devin, and thank you, everyone. My name is Jill Springer. I am NTIA's Chief Environmental Review and Permitting Officer and a Senior Policy Advisor for permitting at NTIA. And I'm very pleased to be able to join you today to talk a little bit about NEPA and permitting for BEAD. It sounds like you're making really great progress within the state, and this is going to be something that will be on your minds, I'm sure, very soon moving forward. So this is a slide that my team developed just to acknowledge that permitting can be a real challenge for broadband projects. As linear projects, even just 1 mile of aerial deployment on existing poles is still going to potentially trigger a lot of requirements for approvals and permits. So in this example, it is acknowledging that if those poles are within a state DOT right-of-way, you will have a right-of-way requirement that triggers Federal Highway Authority authorizations. Sorry about that. Anything going through Bureau of Land Management or another federal land managing agency is going to trigger a requirement for a right-of-way permit from those agencies. Projects that are going on roadways through tribal lands could have permits both from the Bureau of Indian Affairs as well as approvals required from tribal entities. And then there are a number of different state and local, and in some cases, private authorizations. So access to the pole is another thing that we sometimes discuss as a permitting consideration. And to the extent that you're traversing private or municipally owned entities, they're all factors that you need to think about as you are thinking about a proposal to deploy. So NTIA is concurrently supporting and administering 7 different federal broadband grant programs. And as Devin mentioned, the largest of those is the BEAD program at $42.5 billion. But we also have a broadband infrastructure program, a middle mile program, 2 rounds of a tribal broadband connectivity program going on concurrently with BEAD getting underway. And so this is just a conceptual timeline to give folks an idea of what this means in terms of the permit applications that are being generated. And the one thing that's misleading about this timeline is that the actual curve of BEAD, given the amount of funds associated with that program, would really be significantly higher than it is here. And it's shown not in a proportionate way, just to give a sense that right now, as you encounter the different agencies and municipalities that will be dealing with approvals, there are a number of other grant programs that NTIA is administering, as well as federal funds going to support broadband from the Rural Utilities Service, from the Federal Communications Commission, as well as from Treasury. And so acknowledging that this is something that we really needed to do everything that we could at NTIA to support, NTIA has been working in 3 different permitting work streams. And we've kind of arranged these in the order of our influence and our ability really to affect change that can support these grants as they move forward and turn into projects. So the first is NTIA's own NEPA approvals, because federal funding is involved in the BEAD deployments. It will trigger NTIA's own National Environmental Policy Act requirements, as well as other statutory requirements like the National Historic Preservation Act and the other statutes that are under the umbrella of NEPA. The second work stream that we consider for permitting is other federal approvals, and that is those right-of-way accesses that I was mentioning could be necessary from state DOTs on behalf of the federal highway, or from federal land managing agencies or tribal entities where BIA is involved. And we have been working on a number of different efficiencies there. There also can be federal resource permits required from the Army Corps of Engineers to cross waters of the U.S. Or from the Fish and Wildlife Service, where there's potential impact to threatened and endangered species. And then the third work stream that we consider for permitting is state, local, and private approvals. And for this area, we have been identifying the actions that we can take that have the greatest universal benefit. So we have done 2 different DOT webinars with all the state DOT representatives, as well as state broadband offices, to ensure that state DOTs are aware of the Federal Highway Administration's broadband rules, which do support broadband in a number of different ways, and working as well on some local government permitting initiatives. So with respect to that first work stream and NTIA's own NEPA approvals, we've had a lot of success. I'm very happy to report in doing a lot of streamlining in preparation for BEAD. So historically, while NTIA has administered a number of different grant programs for broadband, we had only had 11 categorical exclusions that were available to streamline those reviews. This past year in April, we established 30 new categorical exclusions, and we adopted 6 additional CADXs from the First Responder Network Authority. We've adopted a series of programmatic environmental impact statements for communications projects that the First Responder Network Authority did, that will help support and streamline NEPA reviews once BEAD projects come online. We've also developed a tool that I'll be talking about today, which is a web-based GIS permitting and environmental information application that can help you if you're considering bidding on a BEAD project and you know where the broadband serviceable locations are. It can give you the ability to also identify what federal, state, and to some extent local permits might be required to provide service to those locations, as well as to screen for environmental sensitivities. We've worked with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and have a program comment that is available to streamline Section 106 reviews for BEAD and the other Internet for All programs. Then on our website, we have a series of different types of technical assistance. So on the BEAD program page, there is a NEPA for BEAD link that will provide you access to a number of different templates for environmental review documents. It will provide you with additional guidance on applying that program comment. And then finally, we have done as much as we can to prepare our interagency collaboration, to prepare our other federal colleagues for the broadband permit applications they're going to be seeing. In some cases, we've helped them to adopt our categorical exclusions to streamline those reviews. And I'll talk a little bit about some resources that are available associated with those efforts. Something that is unique to NTIA for BEAD is that the role of the states and the way that NTIA is providing funding to projects through states has enabled NTIA to take advantage of some changes to NEPA that happened as a result of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And these changes allow states to serve as joint lead agencies for NEPA and take more of the control in setting the review schedule for the projects. So this is typical for some other federal funding arrangements. The Federal Highway Administration provides funding to state DOTs. The Department of Housing and Urban Development funds states for community development block grants, and more of the NEPA review is shared by the states in those circumstances. So states will be working directly with NTIA for NEPA purposes and will be doing the initial screening for the applicability of categorical exclusions. As a part of the sub-grantee process, states will be imposing award conditions to ensure the NEPA is completed prior to any construction. and that all of the analyses that are done or that are required under NEPA are completed before construction begins. So in terms of what an individual potential sub-grantee could do to prepare for NEPA, this slide just mentions that environmental and historic preservation is considered by NTIA at various parts and in various stages of the grant life cycle. So today we're going to be talking about pre-award and how you can use some of the tools that I have mentioned to do some pre-screening, and how we are encouraging states to incorporate that, need and ability to identify what categorical exclusions will apply as early as possible in the process. As I mentioned, the second place that NEPA really comes into play is at award in a special award condition to make sure that as those funds are obligated, there is an understanding that NEPA needs to be complete prior to construction. And then post-award, NTIA continues to provide support both to the states as joint lead agencies, but also to sub-grantees through the resources that we have with environmental program officers in every BEAD region, as well as the technical assistance I mentioned, which we continue to develop and to provide. So NEPA, for those of you who don't know, the acronym we've mentioned a couple of times, National Environmental Policy Act. It's an umbrella law passed in 1970, and it incorporates requirements of a number of other statutes, such as Coastal Zone Management Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Endangered Species Act. And these are component analyses that need to be reflected in the NEPA review to ensure that all of these considerations have been taken into account before projects are deployed. So there's 3 different levels of NEPA review. The most intensive for very large and complicated projects is an environmental impact statement. That is not a type of NEPA document that is typical for a broadband project. As I mentioned, our actions to expand the number of categorical exclusions that are available for broadband for NTIA means that the vast majority of projects will qualify for categorical exclusions. And this is the most streamlined type of NEPA review. It typically can be done in about 3 to 6 months, including the composite analyses that I mentioned that are parts of the NEPA umbrella. In addition to whether or not a project just straight qualifies as a type of project that's listed in a categorical exclusion, NTIA also has to consider extraordinary circumstances, and we have 13 different extraordinary circumstances that might need to be accounted for. And again, I'm going to show you with the particularly the mapping tool and some additional resources that we've developed, how you can plan for this and basically maximize the applicability of categorical exclusions to the projects that you're planning. If we can apply a categorical exclusion, the next most detailed type of environmental review is an environmental assessment. And so one of the reasons that we were excited to adopt the First Responder Network's programmatic environmental impact statements is that those documents have analyzed a lot of different types of environmental considerations in each state and territory, and then looked at the potential environmental effects of the typical types of communications infrastructure. And with the Fiscal Responsibility Act changes to NEPA, EAs can incorporate by reference where past reviews have done. And so by doing this, our hope is that we have given the maximum ability to streamline the environmental assessment process and to limit the amount of detailed review that you would have to do to a specific extraordinary circumstance if you're unable to avoid, minimize, or mitigate it through using the tools that I'm going to mention. So categorical exclusions, again, Basically, these are categories of actions that a federal agency has determined and worked with the Council on Environmental Quality to gain their agreement will not typically individually or cumulatively have a significant effect on the human environment. And so they typically don't require an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. They are much more quick to both produce and to approve. And we have a number of different resources available through our technical assistance, including a National Environmental Policy Act guidance document that we released in April when we adopted these new categorical exclusions that list all of the available categorical exclusions, lists the extraordinary circumstances, and then is transparent about how NTIA applies those. So I also mentioned the National Historic Preservation Act. The National Historic Preservation Act is a separate statute from NEPA, but usually the results of that review, which determines if a project will have potentially adverse impacts on historic properties, is one of the considerations that is considered in a NEPA analysis. And for Section 106 consultation, an agency or an applicant acting on behalf of the agency would consult with the State Historic Preservation Office and tribes that might have historic properties of tribal, religious, or cultural significance in a project area to determine if there are historic properties and if there's potential for that project to impact them. There is a traditional Section 106 process that is laid out in the Advisory Council's regulations that can sometimes be criticized for being unpredictable because what's called the areas of potential effect, the study areas, can vary broadly. What's required to identify historic properties can be different from project to project. And so from past broadband programs like those during the Recovery Act, we were able to basically determine that for all of the Section 106 reviews that NTIA and RUS did for the billions of dollars that were invested in broadband at that time, we actually only had one adverse effect as a result of a tower. And drawing on this past experience, we were able to work with the Advisory Council on a program comment that establishes what the areas of potential effect should be, standardizes that for broadband, for fiber deployments, both aerial and buried, as well as towers and other components of broadband projects, and also limits the amount of identification that's required and allows the process to conclude more quickly. So the program comment process, again, I mentioned it establishes routine or standardized areas of potential effect. So you can get started with a much more narrow understanding of what you're looking at. In terms of identifying the historic properties, it establishes as a baseline a desktop review with 3 different options. If there are no historic properties that are in your area of potential effect, and the survey was done within 10 years, the Section 106 review requirement would be met. Similarly, even if there was a historic property or if the survey was not done within the past 10 years, an archaeologist might be able to determine that where you're proposing to deploy is either significantly disturbed or has so little potential for archaeological resources that it would be appropriate to conclude the Section 106 review with no further work. There also are conditional exemptions when you don't conclude the process in those ways that are specific to the deployment types that you would be able to consider after going through those steps. And then finally, for projects where there really is a need to do more, there is the ability to execute a survey or a monitoring agreement that could allow construction to begin in some areas of the project while this work was ongoing. So it should serve to add a lot more predictability to the Section 106 process. I did want to mention also the Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, because it typically, in past broadband projects, both historic preservation Section 106 reviews and Section 7 Endangered Species Act reviews have tended to take the most time. NTIA is currently working with the Fish and Wildlife Service to maximize the applicability of the IPAC system, which is a computerized system available online that would allow you to identify whether or not there are endangered species in the area that you're proposing to deploy. And then to, through something called determination keys, answer a series of questions that might allow you to determine that your project either would have no effect on threatened or endangered species, or may affect but is not likely to adversely affect species without a detailed consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So this programmatic work that we're doing nationwide is one of its kind. We're really excited about the efficiencies that this will offer to what can be a very time-consuming activity for permitting. So in terms of NEPA and sub-grantees, as I mentioned, as joint lead agencies for NEPA, eligible entities, which means states and territories, have to condition sub-grantee awards on completing environmental review. And effectively, we are encouraging the states as they're thinking about this sub-grant process and the application process to encourage potential awardees to take advantage of all those tools. Again, they're all available through our website. All of the new categorical exclusions, basically projects can be planned in a way that they'll qualify as categorically excluded. The mapping tool that can help you do this is not only available to the public through our National Broadband Availability Map site, which I'm going to show you a slide demo of in a minute, but it also is free. And this is, again, kind of historic in NEPA in terms of this type of tool, an agency making this type of tool available, but also broadly available to anyone with no cost. And then also we're encouraging just that as part of the sub-award process, that states are transparent about the fact that NEPA will need to be concluded in order for project construction to begin. So we are providing some kind of a fictional idea of what this could look like and how the permitting tools can play into encouraging subrecipients to be thinking about NEPA up front and reducing the amount of time that it will take you to actually complete those reviews once it's done. So the mapping tool is a screening tool that you can use. We actually have developed, based on our past experience of doing NEPA for broadband projects, a best management practices, so that all of the projects that we've had that have required an environmental assessment have concluded with the agency being able to issue a finding of no significant impact. And that's really important because it means we've never done an EIS or had to do an EIS on a broadband project. Some of those FONSIs, as the acronym goes, did have conditions in them. And basically what we learned from looking at all of those FONSIs were what are the conditions that you can apply to avoid adverse impacts and basically, potentially design a project that you might have designed in a way that triggered an environmental assessment, but with the requirement to incorporate a best management practice. By doing that BMP upfront, you can avoid the need for an environmental assessment. So we've issued this best management practices guide that is online as well. Not only that, we have correlated it with this environmental information screening tool. So if you use the screening tool that I'll show you in a minute, and you determine, for example, that you're proposing to deploy in a wetland, there's a link to the section of that document that will tell you how you might avoid impacts to wetlands. And one way that you might do that is by going aerially on existing poles to the extent that they could be available. So incorporating the best management practices where you might identify environmental considerations in your project area is another thing you can think about up front to plan for success. The mapping tool will also help you to identify the permits that are going to be required. And we've provided some other tools that I'll mention as we get a little further into this presentation. The categorical exclusions, knowing what those CATEXs are and trying to design a project that will qualify as categorically excluded is very possible. And then another thing to think about as you are thinking about proposing on these projects is obtaining consultant support. So the fact that BEAD will simultaneously be going on with some of the other broadband programs that I showed you in that timeline slide, and going on in every state and territory means that there's a lot of demand right now for environmental consultants. So if you have thought about that in advance and identified an environmental consultant that you would plan to work for, that's going to help you expedite NEPA reviews once an award decision is made. And then finally, thinking through what the schedule might look like. So this is a slide demo of the permitting and environmental information application, which is the mapping tool that I've now mentioned, probably 25 times. This mapping tool is available in two places on NTIA's website. One is Broadband USA's permitting page, and that is a resource that I strongly encourage you to take a look at if you haven't already. A lot of the documents and technical assistance I've mentioned is there. But the first thing that you will encounter on our permitting page is a link to this mapping tool with a video tutorial that will show you, if you are not adept at using GIS, how you would go about screening your project using the mapping tool. The mapping tool is also available directly through the National Broadband Availability Map Public GIS Data site at nbam.ntia.gov. When you click on the mapping application, the first thing that comes up is a welcome screen that will encourage you that this is a really great tool and we want you to use it, but it doesn't fully take the place of NEPA. And you are acknowledging that it is a screening tool and not a complete NEPA review. So as you get into the first screen, then actually a map of the United States would come up, and up here where the caret is in the upper right-hand corner on the blue ribbon, you would click that caret and put in the address or location that you would like to take a look at. And in this case, the example that we have here is Springfield, Illinois. So zooming in on Springfield, you will then work your way through the different tabs that are up at this top blue ribbon to take advantage of both the permit identification and the environmental screening that I mentioned. So in this example, federal and tribal lands are turned on here. When you click this ribbon, you would get the ability over here on the right-hand side to turn on or off which lands that you might want to look at. In this example, what is highlighted is U.S. Army Corps of Engineers land parcels. And then in addition, in green here, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lands. And so what information this would tell you is that if you, for example, we're proposing to run fiber down a roadway such as that at the top of the screen here. On one side of the road, you might actually trigger a Fish and Wildlife Service permit where you might be able to avoid that by locating on the other side of the road. We also have a number of different publicly available data sources specific to states. So here in this example, on the state lands tab, we are looking at a project area that could have lands that are under the jurisdiction of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And each of the tables that pop up when you right click on these shaded areas will give you various types of information And for federal lands and permits, you will receive a link to the website location where that federal land managing agency has its broadband permit application requirements and cost recovery considerations, as well as general application processes. So moving along, there's a tab, the third tab, for infrastructure and rights of way, that has a number of different types of data that you can identify here. Rights of way including transportation layers for roads, railroads are included as well. The U.S. Forest Service designated communication sites are a part of this tab. Energy facilities, so you can find transmission lines and corridors, pipelines, just a number of different factors that might be relevant as you are thinking about what types of permits and authorizations would be required to provide service in a specific area. Moving into the environmental tabs, we have incorporated into our tool all of the NEPA assist layers from the Fish and Wildlife Services IPAC system, flood layers. And so you can find here in the floodplain and wetland area indications by turning on the various types of resources where you might have a consideration for a crossing, such as a lake or reservoir or a river that could trigger an Army Corps permit. Also marshes, swamps, bogs, and prairies that might be considered wetlands. Again, then you would be triggered to follow the link that could help you identify what the best management practices would be to deploy in those areas. We have another tab up here for critical habitat. Here you see turning this tab on and turning on the indication for critical habitats for threatened and endangered species. An area is identified here for the Indiana bat. I did ask our biologists in advance the status of determination keys that are available in Illinois right now. We have not yet gotten within our project to the expansion of your statewide determination keys, but there is a determination key for the Indiana bat. So going through, potentially you would be able to conclude your consultation requirements by following the link to the IPAC system in our screening tool once your project was awarded. And then finally, historic places. So the data that is in here comes from the National Register of Historic Places. Right now, we only have state eligible or listed data and information for 5 different states. It's not publicly available for all of the states, but certainly will work with your federal program officer and Devin and her staff if we are able to get access to Illinois' historic properties so that we can incorporate it into the tool. And then finally, the last tab here shows you all of the hundreds of data sources that are part of our mapping tool. And so this is helpful if you have your own GIS system. You can ingest the relevant layers into your GIS to assist you with project planning. So in terms of other federal, state, and local permitting considerations, just wanted to mention again that post-award, there are a number of different federal permits, state permits, and regional and local permitting considerations that will be necessary in order to deploy. And so we are, through our mapping tool, trying to give you as much ability to identify those in advance without fail. All of the permitting agencies that I have ever talked to have encouraged me to have applicants thinking about deploying in areas under their jurisdiction to talk to them, become educated, take a look at the web resources that they have, and have a conversation before you're applying for your permit so that you are as prepared as best as possible. On the federal side, a number of different federal land managing agencies can be associated either with real property actions for rights of way or for resource permits. And so this is just a partial list of the types of federal agencies that might be involved in permitting, federal permitting. So one of the benefits of the work that we've been doing with other federal agencies to prepare them for broadband permitting is that working with the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, a number of federal agencies have been able to get surge funding for extra staff to help support broadband permitting. In addition to that, we provided a map-based tool to all of the federal agencies that shows their federal lands boundaries in every state overlaid over the broadband serviceable locations. So all of those federal agencies are aware now where infrastructure will need to be constructed in order for BEAD to bring high-speed internet to every American. So we have been doing a lot of pre-planning and preparation with the other federal agencies. So as I mentioned, identifying that permit requirement as early as possible is key, tracking them all, identifying the permit type and the requirements associated with that permit, engaging early, making sure that whomever is assisting you with permitting is really thorough in their application, submit all of the required documentation and follow up and track your application. For federal permitting, there is a standard form. It's called the SF-299 that is used by most land managing agencies. You can see here BLM, other DOI agencies, Department of Transportation, GSA, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, and Department of Agriculture, including the Forest Service, use the SF-299. We, as part of this preparation, have actually identified all of the regional and district level permitting, federal permitting representatives. And between September of 2023 and March of 2024, we convened federal broadband permitting meetings with those individuals. We understood that it wasn't enough for us to be talking here in DC on the headquarters level and risking that the people who would actually be processing these applications would not have any awareness or visibility into the fact that those mapping resources have been provided to their offices, so they know already where to expect permitting. So we are in ongoing engagement with all of these folks and have great contacts. We were able to introduce our federal program officers in every state and territory to the federal permitting folks that they will be working with as your projects become permit applications. So local permitting is another thing that will be necessary. It's a very important thing in terms of the safety of deployment. Local governments include county governments, municipalities, regional planning agencies that oversee land, infrastructure, and utilities. They are going to complete compliance checks and have various requirements to deploy within their jurisdictions. They're also really key in communications and outreach to local communities, which is really important. In terms of streamlining considerations for local permitting, you know, choosing the right site from the beginning is very important. Planning ahead. I recently have participated in a collaboration, a local permitting summit that released a report that is available through our website that talks about some things that have been really effective in different municipalities, like master lease agreements and other other outreach and engagement that can really help to make sure that the process moves as in as streamlined of a fashion as possible. Through this work, particularly on the local level, we have become even more aware of the importance of utility coordination and are encouraging all state broadband offices as part of their development of a permitting task force or thinking about the NEPA and other permitting responsibilities, to be engaging the state's 811 office on the broadband team. What we found in states like Arkansas is that these are key players and key partners who, in Arkansas, I was at the first broadband task force meeting, and the 811 representatives were talking about their personal relationships with entities, permitting entities in all 75 counties. And so 811 services are a great source of information and great partners as well in broadband deployment, but utility coordination can come into play for pole access for electric co-ops, where those are the owners of the poles. And also just in general, in another early consideration that can reduce deployment time and costs and prevent unexpected delays to projects moving on. So we have a permitting needs assessment document that is also available on the Broadband USA planning page that has a series of checklists, including this checklist that is meant to get you thinking about things like utility easements and access easements and the requirements for things like surveys and ensuring that surveys are accurate. Obtaining information and awareness of zoning ordinances, engagement with zoning offices and requirements for zoning application as well. So I think in my closing message here with this slide is NTIA has done a lot of work to try to develop and to provide a lot of resources upfront and a lot of tools in addition to working with particularly the federal agencies, permitting agencies, to prepare them and to put into place streamlining measures like additional categorical exclusions and the program comment and these programmatic Section 7 tools that we're working on. So I encourage you to visit the Internet for All website, visit Broadband USA, particularly the permitting page. It's my page, so I'm gonna keep plugging it. Take a look at the the permitting and environmental information application. If you're not an experienced GIS practitioner, don't be shy about taking a look at the video tutorial. It's relatively short, and I know it helped me. I am not a GIS expert at all. But there are quite a few resources that are out there. In addition, I see that Greg is on. Greg Klaus is the federal program officer for Illinois, and our federal program officers are great resources. I and the rest of my permitting team and our environmental and historic preservation teams are also available to support you moving forward. So we're really excited to be working with the states on this historic opportunity to bring broadband, high-speed broadband and internet service to every American. And so thank you for listening and hopefully for participating. And if there are any questions, I think we have a couple minutes.
Thank you so much, Jill. If folks have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we can go through those. I'll share from the state side. I'll be kind of closely engaging with NTIA and with Jill to figure out the best way that as a state we can support applicants both in the application phase and then prior to project launch. Because I know some of these processes can be complex. So, we have some state resources that we could lend to make this as straightforward and streamlined as possible. But we really appreciate all of the information and clear slides. Any questions from folks?
I realize it was a lot. Please feel free to follow up and Devin and others, if you get any subsequent questions or make these materials available and receive some, please have Greg reach out to me, and I am very happy to either talk to someone directly or work to get you the information that you need.
Great. And I think even just having these slides handy and, as a state office, we can kind of direct folks to, okay, what do you need to know for this part of the process and what's more of a longer term decision. So I think this will be a great resource for all of us. All right. Well, if there are no specific questions at this time, I'm happy to wrap early. And thank you so much again to Jill for joining us today. And as shared, we'll be sending out the recording and the slides and any other resources so you can start poking around online. And of course, if there are specific supports that you need, just reach out to me or broadband@illinois.gov so we can incorporate your feedback into our processes. But don't hesitate to reach out with any further questions.
Thank you, everyone. And thank
All
you, David,
right.
for having me.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Devin.